Mrs. Anderson loved her job as a teacher. Every morning, she walked into her classroom, ready to help her students learn and grow. She believed every child mattered, no matter their background, abilities, or challenges. One of her favorite students was Ethan, an 8-year-old boy who used a wheelchair to get around. Ethan was smart and kind, but he often seemed shy. His old wheelchair made things harder for him. It squeaked loudly, sometimes got stuck, and needed repairs far too often. Mrs. Anderson noticed how hard Ethan tried to keep up with the other kids. During recess, he'd watch them play tag or race each other, smiling even though he couldn't join in. In class, he worked extra hard to turn in his assignments on time, even if it took him longer because of his chair. One day, during art class, the students were working on a group project. They had to gather supplies from different corners of the room. Ethan's wheelchair suddenly stopped moving. He couldn't roll forward or backward. "I think something's wrong," Ethan said softly, looking upset. Mrs. Anderson knelt beside him and saw that the wheel was jammed. She didn't hesitate. "Don't worry, Ethan. We'll fix this together." She asked the janitor for tools and quickly figured out how to unjam the wheel. Within minutes, Ethan's chair was working again. He grinned brightly at her. "Thank you, Mrs. Anderson." But not everyone saw what happened the same way. The principal walked by just as she was fixing the chair. Instead of praising her for helping Ethan, he frowned deeply. "This isn't your job," he said sternly. "You're here to teach, not play mechanic." Mrs. Anderson stood up, brushing off her hands. "Ethan needed help. I couldn't just leave him stuck." The principal shook his head. "There are proper channels for these things. You should have called maintenance." Mrs. Anderson bit her lip but didn't argue. She knew she'd done the right thing, but little did she know, this moment would change everything for her. The next day, Mrs. Anderson couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The principal's disapproving glare lingered in her mind, but she tried to focus on her students. Ethan seemed happier after yesterday's incident, chatting more with his classmates and even volunteering to answer questions during math class. Seeing his smile made her feel like she'd done the right thing. But later that afternoon, things took a turn. The principal called her into his office after school. "Mrs. Anderson," he began, his tone sharp, "we need to talk about what happened yesterday." "I was just helping Ethan," she replied calmly. "His wheelchair broke, and I fixed it so he could keep learning." "That's not your responsibility," the principal said firmly. "You're here to teach, not handle maintenance issues. What if another student needed attention while you were distracted? What message does this send to the rest of the staff?" Mrs. Anderson frowned. "Ethan is my responsibility. All my students are. If something is stopping them from learning, I'll do whatever it takes to fix it." The principal sighed, clearly frustrated. "Your intentions may be good, but you're setting a dangerous precedent. Other teachers might think they can step outside their roles too, and then where will we be? Chaos." "It's not chaos to help a child," Mrs. Anderson shot back. "It's common decency." The principal ignored her comment and continued. "I've received complaints from some parents who think you're neglecting the rest of the class when you focus so much on one student." Mrs. Anderson's heart sank. She had always gone out of her way to make sure every child felt valued. How could anyone accuse her of neglect? "This isn't fair," she said quietly. "Ethan deserves the same opportunities as everyone else." Fixing his chair wasn't neglect. It was ensuring he could participate. "I'm sorry," the principal said, though he didn't sound sorry at all. "But I have no choice. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending further review." Mrs. Anderson left the office in shock. Suspended for helping a child? It didn't make sense. Word spread quickly among the students. By the end of the week, several parents had written letters supporting her, praising her dedication and kindness. Even Ethan's mom came to the school, asking to speak with the principal. "She changed my son's life," Ethan's mom told the receptionist. "How can they punish someone for being kind?" Despite the support, the damage was done. A few days later, Mrs. Anderson received an official letter informing her that she was fired. Devastated, she packed up her classroom, tears streaming down her face. Her career, her passion, was being taken away because she'd chosen to do what was right. As she walked out of the school for the last time, Ethan ran up to her, holding a drawing he'd made. It showed Mrs. Anderson fixing his wheelchair, with big hearts drawn around them both. "Thank you for helping me," Ethan said softly. Mrs. Anderson knelt down and hugged him tightly. "You'll always be my favorite artist," she whispered, trying to hold back more tears. She didn't know it yet, but Ethan's dad was already planning to step in, and the fight was far from over. Mrs. Anderson sat at her kitchen table that evening, staring blankly at the termination letter in front of her. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She had spent years pouring her heart into teaching, helping children learn, grow, and believe in themselves. And now all of it was gone because she'd fixed a wheelchair. Her husband, Mark, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You did nothing wrong," he said firmly. "If anything, they're the ones who messed up." "But what am I supposed to do now?" Mrs. Anderson asked, her voice trembling. "Teaching isn't just my job. It's who I am. How can I walk away from that?" "You won't have to," Mark replied. "This isn't over yet. People are already talking about how unfair this is. Maybe something good will come out of it." Mrs. Anderson shook her head. "Even if it does, it doesn't change the fact that I lost my job for helping a child." Just then, there was a knock at the door. Mark went to answer it, and moments later, Ethan's dad, Mr. Carter, stepped inside. He was dressed in a sharp suit, his expression serious but kind. "Mrs. Anderson," he began, extending his hand. "I'm Ethan's father. Thank you for everything you've done for my son." Mrs. Anderson stood up, surprised. "Mr. Carter, please sit down." He nodded and took a seat at the table. "Ethan told me what happened at school, the wheelchair breaking, you fixing it, and then your firing. I want you to know how much we appreciate you. You didn't just help him physically. You made him feel seen and valued when others might not have." "I'm glad I could help," Mrs. Anderson said softly. "But it cost me my job." Mr. Carter leaned forward, his tone firm. "That's exactly why I'm here. What happened to you is unacceptable. No teacher should be punished for showing compassion. Let me fight this, for you and for every student like Ethan who deserves better." Mrs. Anderson hesitated. "What can you do?" The principal made up his mind. Mr. Carter smiled slightly. "Let's just say I know a thing or two about holding people accountable. Trust me, I'll make sure they regret this decision." For the first time since leaving the school, Mrs. Anderson felt a flicker of hope. If anyone could take on the system, it was someone like Mr. Carter. The next morning, Mr. Carter got to work. He started by requesting copies of the school's policies on supporting students with disabilities. What he found, or rather what he didn't find, shocked him. The school had no clear guidelines for assisting disabled students beyond vague promises of inclusion. There were no funds allocated for wheelchair maintenance, no designated staff trained to help, and no emergency protocols for situations like Ethan's broken chair. "This is worse than I thought," Mr. Carter muttered as he sifted through the documents. "They're setting these kids up to fail." He called a meeting with the school board, presenting his findings in a calm but firm manner. "Mrs. Anderson was fired for stepping in where your system failed," he explained. "Instead of punishing her, you should be thanking her and fixing the problems that made her intervention necessary." The school board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of them finally spoke up. "We understand your concerns, Mr. Carter, but teachers have specific roles. They can't take on responsibilities outside those roles. It disrupts the entire system." "Disrupts the system?" Mr. Carter repeated, his voice rising slightly. "What about disrupting a child's education or dignity? My son couldn't move because his wheelchair broke. If Mrs. Anderson hadn't stepped in, he would have sat there helpless while you waited for maintenance to show up, which, according to your records, takes an average of 2 days." The room fell silent. Mr. Carter continued, his tone sharp. "This isn't just about one teacher or one student. This is about accountability. You're failing children like Ethan every single day, and it needs to stop." Word of Mr. Carter's involvement spread quickly. Parents began calling the school, demanding answers. Local news outlets picked up the story, highlighting Mrs. Anderson's dismissal and the lack of support for disabled students. One parent, Mrs. Lewis, whose daughter also used a wheelchair, joined the fight. "My child has been ignored too many times," she told reporters. "If we don't stand up now, nothing will ever change." Meanwhile, Mrs. Anderson stayed home, unsure how to feel. Part of her wanted to believe Mr. Carter could fix things, but another part worried it was hopeless. Schools had rules, and rules rarely bent, not even for good intentions. Then, one afternoon, there was another knock at her door. This time, it was Ethan and his dad. "Mrs. Anderson," Mr. Carter said with a smile, "I think you'll want to hear this." He handed her a letter from the school district. It was an apology for mishandling the situation and failing to provide adequate resources for disabled students. They promised to reinstate her immediately and review their policies. Tears welled up in Mrs. Anderson's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, looking at both Ethan and his father. "I couldn't have done this without you." Ethan grinned. "You're our hero, Mrs. Anderson." For the first time in weeks, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could make a difference after all. With the school district under pressure, Mr. Carter didn't stop there. He knew an apology and reinstatement weren't enough to create lasting change. The system needed a complete overhaul, and he was determined to make it happen. He organized a community meeting at the local library, inviting parents, teachers, and disability advocates to discuss what could be done. Mrs. Anderson attended as well, her heart swelling with gratitude for the support she'd received. "We can't let this slide," Mr. Carter said, addressing the crowded room. "The school failed Ethan, Mrs. Anderson, and countless others because they haven't prioritized inclusion. It's time we demand better, not just for our kids, but for every child who deserves equal opportunities." One by one, people shared their stories. A mother talked about how her son's classroom wasn't wheelchair accessible. A teacher described being reprimanded for spending too much time helping a student with dyslexia. Each story painted a picture of a broken system that valued convenience over compassion. Mrs. Anderson listened intently, realizing she wasn't alone. So many others had faced similar struggles, and now they were ready to fight together. Mr. Carter proposed a plan: draft a formal list of demands for the school district, including better resources for disabled students, mandatory training for staff, and regular reviews of accessibility policies. He also suggested starting a fundraiser to provide immediate assistance, like repairing wheelchairs or purchasing adaptive learning tools. The group worked tirelessly over the next few weeks, gathering signatures, organizing rallies, and spreading awareness online. Local media covered their efforts extensively, drawing attention from neighboring towns and even state officials. When the school board finally agreed to meet again, they were met with a packed auditorium. Parents, students, and teachers filled every seat, holding signs that read, "Inclusion matters. Support every learner. Thank you, Mrs. Anderson." As Mr. Carter presented the group's demands, the board members looked visibly uneasy. They hadn't expected such unity or such determination. "We'll do whatever it takes to fix this," the superintendent promised, clearly feeling the weight of public opinion. For Mrs. Anderson, watching the crowd cheer felt surreal. She had started out trying to help one student, and now she was part of a movement that could transform the entire education system. The school district acted quickly under the growing pressure. Within weeks, they implemented several of the group's demands, starting with immediate changes to support disabled students. A new budget was approved to ensure wheelchairs and other assistive devices were maintained regularly. Staff members received training on inclusivity, learning how to better accommodate students with disabilities in classrooms and beyond. Mrs. Anderson returned to work, greeted by a standing ovation from her colleagues and students. Ethan beamed as he rolled up to her desk, holding out another drawing. This time of Mrs. Anderson surrounded by smiling kids, all labeled family. "You're back," Ethan exclaimed, hugging her tightly. "I am," she replied, tears streaming down her face. "And I'm not going anywhere." But the changes didn't stop there. The school board created a special committee dedicated to accessibility and inclusion, appointing Mrs. Anderson as an advisor. Her first-hand experience made her the perfect advocate for ensuring no child would ever feel forgotten again. Word of the reforms spread far beyond their small town. Other schools began reaching out, asking for advice on how to improve their own systems. Mrs. Anderson found herself speaking at conferences, sharing her story and urging educators to prioritize compassion over convenience. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Mr. Carter stopped by her classroom to check in. "How are you holding up?" he asked with a smile. "I'm good," she admitted, looking around at the colorful posters and student artwork covering the walls. "Better than good, actually. For the first time, I feel like we're making real progress, not just for Ethan, but for everyone." Mr. Carter nodded proudly. "You're the reason this happened, you know. If you hadn't stood up for my son, none of this would have been possible." "It wasn't just me," Mrs. Anderson replied. "It was all of us working together. That's what made the difference." Ethan peeked into the room, interrupting their conversation. "Dad, can we go get ice cream? To celebrate?" "Of course," Mr. Carter laughed. Turning back to Mrs. Anderson, he added, "You should join us. After everything you've done, it's the least we can do." She hesitated, then smiled. "I'd love that." As they walked toward the parking lot, laughing and chatting, Mrs. Anderson realized something profound. Kindness had sparked this journey, but community had carried it forward. Together, they had turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change. Months later, the impact of Mrs. Anderson's bravery was undeniable. The school had transformed into a model of inclusivity, with new ramps, accessible classrooms, and programs tailored to meet diverse needs. Students like Ethan thrived in an environment where they felt valued and supported, a testament to what could happen when people came together for a common cause. Mrs. Anderson embraced her role as both a teacher and an advocate. She spent her days teaching reading, math, and science, but also mentoring other educators on how to create inclusive spaces. Her classroom became a safe haven for students who once felt invisible, and her influence extended far beyond its walls. One afternoon, during a school assembly, the principal invited Mrs. Anderson to speak about the changes that had taken place. Standing in front of the entire student body, she felt a mix of nerves and pride. "When I started teaching," she began, "I believed every child deserved a chance to succeed. But sometimes, even teachers need reminders of what truly matters. For me, that reminder came from Ethan, and from all of you." She paused, smiling at the sea of faces before her. "This isn't just my victory, it's ours. Together, we proved that kindness and courage can change the world. And if we keep standing up for each other, there's nothing we can't achieve." The auditorium erupted into applause, with students cheering loudly. Ethan waved enthusiastically from the front row, his wheelchair gleaming under the stage lights. Afterward, as parents and teachers mingled outside, Mr. Carter approached Mrs. Anderson once more. "You've inspired so many people," he said warmly. "Not just here, but everywhere your story has reached." "I didn't do it alone," she replied. "It took all of us, students, parents, teachers, to make this happen. That's what makes it so special." As the sun set over the playground, Mrs. Anderson watched Ethan race his friends in a game of tag, his laughter echoing through the air. For the first time in years, she felt truly hopeful, not just for herself, but for the future of education. Her journey had started with a single act of kindness, fixing a broken wheelchair. But it had grown into something much bigger, a movement that reminded everyone of the power of compassion and the importance of fighting for what's right. And as she stood there, surrounded by smiling faces and stories of triumph, she knew one thing for certain. No matter how hard the road might be, love and determination could always light the way forward. And that's the end of the teacher, the boy, and the father. Glowing star. We hope this story touched your heart and reminded you of the incredible power of kindness, courage, and community. Mrs. Anderson's journey shows us that standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, can spark meaningful change that reaches far beyond our expectations. Now, we'd love to hear from you. What did you think of the story? Did it inspire you or make you reflect on your own experiences? Where are you watching from? Are you tuning in from the US, India, the UK, or somewhere else in the world? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear about your corner of the globe. If you enjoyed this tale of compassion and resilience, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that celebrate humanity and the beauty of making a difference. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue sharing these heartfelt narratives. Lastly, drop a comment below and share. Sparkles, what was your favorite moment in the story? Sparkles, have you ever witnessed or been part of a situation where someone stood up for others? Thank you so much for joining us on this inspiring journey with Mrs. Anderson, Ethan, and Mr. Carter. We're grateful for your time and enthusiasm, and we can't wait to bring you more stories that uplift, inspire, and connect us all. Red Heart, until next time, stay kind, stay brave, and never underestimate the ripple effect of doing what's right.